This is Macro Analytics, delivering frank conversations on global macroeconomics and market analysis, outside the mainstream, featuring discussions and debates between Gordon T. Long, publisher and editor of GordonTLong.com, and his guests. The content of this discussion is strictly the opinion of the participants. It is in no way a solicitation for business, nor is it to be considered investment advice of any sort. Always consult a registered investment advisor before making any investment decision. These discussions are extremely hard-hitting and terribly frank, and parental discretion is advised. Now, on to the show.
Good morning. I'm Gord Long with GordonTLong.com. It's my pleasure to have back with me this morning Charles Hugh Smith, well-known and prolific writer on the web, who's the publisher of the website of2minds.com and longtime co-host with me here on Macro Analytics. Good morning, Charles.
Good morning, Gordon. Glad to be here as always.
What's new in your life?
I've just released my new book, A Radically Beneficial World, about automation and jobs. So that's been my big project recently.
And how can our listeners order the book?
They can go to Amazon and find it there, or they can read more about it, read the sample chapter and introduction on my site of 2minds.com.
You'd almost think that we had planned this little plug, but we hadn't. But it just worked out that way. But I always like to promote your books, Charles. Which book number is this, by the way? I'm losing track.
Yeah, me too. I think it's number 9 of nonfiction.
Okay, because I've announced on this show quite a number with you. But let's just jump into our subject. What we're going to talk, we agreed to, we're going to talk about this week or this month is the participation rate. No surprise to any listener of how it's been plummeting for quite some time. But if you ask anybody, what's the reason for the participation rate? There's no universal agreement on what is causing it. It's just that it's so bad. So I thought we'd jump into it. I have up a chart to begin that actually comes from you. You put up in one of your sites. And do you want to make some comments on that chart before I make some on it too?
Well, Gordon, I think the key point to me of this chart, which goes back from, it traces the labor participation rate from 1960 forward, is that it gives us a long-term perspective on this issue of how many people are actively participating in the workforce. They're either looking for a job or they have a job. And you can see that the red line, the trend line, has been declining very steeply for 40 years. Now, that's a significant trend. And I just want to point out that we're talking about a trend that's driven by forces that have nothing to do with the Fed policy or interest rates or who's president. None of those kind of little policy things have anything to do with these large demographic trends we're talking about. And so you can see that there were blips here and there, but the significance to me is that line is relentlessly declining for 40 years.
Yeah, and it's really important. I think everybody kind of knows that, but they don't fully appreciate it. And it says, well, what's this really got to do with the recent drop in the participation rate? Because for the first 25 years of that period, the growth in jobs was increasing dramatically in the participation rate. But it's really important we start with this chart. And what's important to me, Charles, is the peak was in 1970, right? When it really started coming down. And a little personal story here, and I've got one that's annotated. I joined IBM in 1970, and that wasn't such a big event, but the point was when I joined, I spent my days explaining to people what a computer was, honest to God. In the area that I was in, we had 2 big computers at the 2 big universities and one at a big insurance company in the back office doing something that nobody else really knew what they were doing. Maybe printing. They weren't even printing policies at the time. They were doing calculations. But it was an era where nobody knew. They knew what a computer was, sort of, but nobody had it in their businesses to speak of. But as you see as you go across this line, things started changing dramatically. Then we had something called word processing came out, and all of a sudden we replaced all of the centers where women were, well, I say women because they were predominantly a big part of them, were typists. They were secretaries and secretarial pools, words that people aren't familiar with today. But this continuous, relentless cascading effect of technology has been with us throughout that period of time. And what it is doing is cutting jobs. Every time it came out, it reduced massive amounts of jobs or reinvented sectors. It didn't mean that it didn't create some new jobs, for example, webmasters and everything else, and programmers of huge proportion, but not in proportion to the jobs it was taking out after the dot-com bubble. And today, as we'll get into the participation curve, it's accelerated because on the right you can see where public now has really just completely accepted and is using all of the technology, and it's ubiquitous. It's absolutely everywhere. Any little company you go into, not only do they have a computer, but they're working on their iPhones, and they're out on a construction site. The information's coming in that fashion. That reduces labor. It makes us more effective, but it reduces the number of jobs that are required. And that's the wave that we fully have to understand. Comments on that, Charles?
Well, Gordon, I like the way that you've tied it into your own career, because all of us of a certain age can go back and remember our first computer and how limited the memory was, and yet what an enormous boon to productivity that even that simple basic computer was. So, and the other thing I think you've touched on, which I think we should emphasize, is we're talking about technology here that is not just high tech or social media. As you mentioned in construction, all the logistical chain and the accounting, all the back office of construction has been streamlined by technology. And so there may be the same crew of guys pounding nails out on the site, but there's been a huge reduction of labor behind those guys. And the same is true of industrial companies such as Boeing. We think of it as, well, they make airplanes, but mostly what they do is digital processing, the engineering of those aircraft, right? And the flow of materials and orders and all that stuff. So I think your point is really important, is that this technology is changing every sector of the economy, not just high tech.
Exactly. It's everything. It's just right. We all, and I think every listener knows this. So what's our point? Why are we talking about the obvious? If you look at this next chart I have up, now we're showing the participation curve. But you'll notice that I got a little red arrow here at the bottom, which is 1970 also. So, but in 1970, I said we started bringing in the technology and the jobs reduced. But look at the rate of growth of participation, and the biggest reason for that was the entry of women into the workforce. Prior to 1970, very, very few women were participating other than secretaries and nurses or teachers. I know I was from that era, but as more and more were going to college, going out and getting professional jobs, it just exploded. The neighborhoods that I was in, all the wives stayed at home. By the time I was in college, fewer were staying at home. By the time I bought my first house, everybody had both people working. And that's the explosion. So we exploded upwards here. And you notice the peak is right around 2000, when the dot-com bubble burst. So the internet had come in, but the internet hadn't become ubiquitous because broadband hadn't allowed it to become ubiquitous. It had created more jobs as programmers came in. We had job fairs. I know here in New England, there'd be 50 pages of job ads and job fairs in the nightly paper. Today, by the way, the job ad page, well, nobody gets a newspaper, and the job ads are non-existent. So something dramatically has changed. But that's the reason it grows. So the issue is, and then it's turned off and it's fallen down. And why is it fallen down? And maybe just as importantly, why is it accelerating? Because in fact, it is accelerating. Comments on that, Charles?
Well, Gordon, I think this demographic movement is, again, one of these large-scale structural changes, and that cannot be affected by tiny adjustments in policy, like a tax credit or something. You're not going to change these huge forces of technology and demographics. And so what we're really asking is, what are the demographic reasons for this decline in the participation rate? And you've nailed down something that I think is completely under reported, which is the rising cost of childcare.
Precisely.
And as we were speaking about before we started the program, the rapid entry of women into the workforce was predicated on low-cost childcare being available, so that women could have children and have them taken care of and go to work. And now the cost of childcare is becoming so prohibitive that a lot of people have to choose between having children and having a job. And if you don't have a job, then your family income is, of course, roughly half. So that means you're not going to have the income that you would have had if the women could work and have affordable childcare. So
that's precisely correct. That's one of the reasons that it's accelerating. Charles, I have up a chart here that shows the United States and various countries around the world. Because everybody's got generally a similar demographic, similar kind of issue, maybe different rate of adoption of women, for example, coming into the workforce. But the black line clearly shows that the United States has something unique that's happened to it from about 2000 on. And it's falling off, and the rest have been flat, maybe even rising in terms of participation. But ours has fallen off. So there's something unique that's different that's happened since the dot-com implosion, and certainly since the 2008. And as you pointed out, and I've discussed, is childcare. It's just one of a number of things that have changed, and they've changed for many reasons. Because of the technology, labor's not as valued unless it's very, very high skilled. And so jobs are harder to find, but jobs that are well paying are very tough to find. And so a lot of the jobs that are out there are low paying hourly jobs, or relatively low paying. So with childcare becomes a big issue. And in the last few years with Obamacare, various policies, there's been a big push to make sure that companies move people to part-time work, so that they stayed under the cap of the number of hours, so that they didn't have to cover them a medical coverage before Obamacare changed part of that. But so when you're sitting there and one of your spouses doesn't have enough hours, how do you support the family needs? Well, what happens is it actually becomes more economical for one of the spouses to take care of the kids, especially if they even get laid off. And that's why I know in my area, there are as many stay-at-home dads as there are moms, and I say that just as a fact. And it seems to be who got cut, who got laid off, or who had their hours brought back. And so the costs are just so horrendous for whether it's a baby, whether it's an infant, whether they're first or second, in up through middle school. It's a major problem. But it's only one of, I would say, three things that are going on.
Right. But Gordon, I think it's worth exploring that topic. And you have a chart on food stamps. And
exactly.
What I know from our young friends is that the young people who have low-paying jobs, they qualify for low-income programs for the working poor. And this includes food stamps, Medicaid, Section 8 housing. And so it's actually sort of ironic, if you will, that it's actually easier and more affordable to have a child if you're a working poor person, in other words, with relatively low income, because there's a lot of federal program support for you and your family. Whereas if you're a middle-class person, you make too much money to qualify for those programs, but you don't make enough to pay for childcare. So we're looking at a bifurcation where you have to be in the upper middle class with one very large income where there can be a stay-at-home parent, or you're a working poor person and everybody in between can't afford to have children. What does that mean for our society?
That's the choice that they have. Ever mind them sitting to realize what it's going to cost to eventually send those children to college. And they don't have a pension plan, the parents. How are they even going to be retired at some point in time to get their kids through college? These are the realities. And they're not getting married till much later in life now. They're not starting families or even buying houses till later now. These have huge ramifications that's shifting. But from a participation standpoint, you notice the dates here on this food stamp chart you mentioned. There's a dramatic shift that started in this period that we're talking about. And the technologies, public policies have created this sort of thing. Youth is another issue, because the youth can't find jobs today. and they can't find well-paying jobs. And so we've had this whole concept of internships, which means you work for nothing to get enough experience to get a job. And I've got friends of mine who've got children that are approaching 30 years old and are still working as interns and have just recently got jobs that actually pay enough that they can now afford their own health insurance. And these are well-educated kids. That's the difficulty that's going up. I mean, there's all sorts of exceptions. That's not, but I'm saying it's enough that in there that it really starts to distort the participation rate. They can't find the work, and it seems to be getting worse. And I need to be really careful here too, Charles. They can find jobs, but they're not jobs where you can live on the salary. They can find jobs at donut shops and different places, but if you look at the $12 an hour they're making, they can't cover their basic expenses of cars, never mind have their own apartment. So they're living with their parents in the basement. So there's I see lots of signs around job, people for hire, work, or jobs wanted ads. But if you really look at what the job is, you can't live on the wage. So people are having 2 and 3 jobs.
Right, right. And Gordon, we've covered this in previous shows, and I do delve into it in my new book because you have a slide here, skills obsolescence and the youth internship. I think the forces that are driving this are labor is no longer scarce. In other words, we have an oversupply of people with college degrees. We have an oversupply of people without college degrees. And so just in terms of basic fundamental economics, if things are in abundance, then you don't have any scarcity value. And so that's why the value of labor is declining, is we have more people that want a job than there are jobs. And why is that? Well, part of the thing of the technology that we've been discussing is the skill level required to be profitable in the digital economy is just completely of a higher order than it was in previous generations. And in other words, in the 60s, you could make a very good living going to an assembly line, and you could learn your job in literally 10 minutes most of the time, or in a day at most, right? Because you were on an assembly line. Once you learned what parts you were using and what tools you were using, then that was that. And even like then when the 70s and 80s that we're talking about, to be a salesperson, you don't have to know 3 different fields of knowledge to be a salesperson. You familiarize yourself with what you're selling, and then you learn by experience, right? It didn't take a master's degree to get a sales job. And then in the early tech boom, it didn't take that much to learn HTML and have value, right? I mean, that's what I did. I was creating value with really, by today's standards, rudimentary skills. Well, now you have to have really high level skills, and you have to have a really high bandwidth. You have to constantly be learning. You have to, being able to code 1 program is no longer enough. You need 3. And then those 3 will be out of date in a few years, and you have to learn 3 more. And that level of skill is difficult to attain and to maintain.
Yeah. Because you may have it, then you're just as quickly obsoleted because the industry you're in or the technology obsoletes, and you haven't been able to keep up.
Exactly.
So that's part these are huge numbers, and this is what's impacting the participation rate. Since that date, the 2000s cusp that we're talking about, the peak, we've had 52,000 factories leave America. Just, I didn't say the companies have left, but the factory automation and building process have left America. Do you know how many production specialists, manufacturing specialists, logistics specialists were out of work? So if you're a manufacturer, and I probably could start listing 100 names in there. So they're out of work. So where do they go? They can't go to another factory. They can't go find another. It's gone. That industry is gone. So the answer is, well, go back to university and retrain yourself. Well, I saw a lot of them try and get into real estate selling because it was hot when the cuts were happening. Well, that hasn't worked out because they're not selling enough houses. And then I got to see them working over at Home Depot, but they're not making just an hourly wage from a salary wage. So saying reinvent yourself is a very difficult proposition when we're talking hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people who then, even if they retrain themselves, where is the jobs that they're being retrained for? And do they pay enough to work on? And I think we're completely underestimating the rate of skills obsolescence that goes back to what we started with, this relentless technology wave, and it isn't going to slow down. Charles, because it's coming to the retail industry. And I think who've been a big employer of numbers of people. You go into a Target store around here, they're running 3 shifts, 7 days a week. They're only closed 6 hours a day. They'll employ 225 people in one store. And you don't realize how many people are low paying, hard to get by on. But what happens when we start to go to the next wave of kiosks and technology and it's coming, and especially with beacon technology, suddenly they'll be able to do that with, maybe 60 people. McDonald's, they're putting hamburger automated machines in and kiosks. They're going to dramatically cut their workforce. So where are those low-paying jobs? They're just disappearing.
Right.
How do you retrain? What do you retrain from that?
Exactly, Gordon. And I think that this is what people are underestimating, is that there were tens of millions of relatively low-skilled jobs created in the previous booms, and this digital boom, as you pointed out, now that the web and digital tools are ubiquitous, basically the customer is replacing the employee. In other words, we check out ourselves. We pump our own gas and so on and so forth. And this is not just because corporate leaders are greedy. It's like, if they don't do this, they will die. It's that simple. Someone else will do it and their business will vanish.
So this is all the bad news. What are the ramifications going forward? And you've actually written on this. It's about the nature of work is changing, isn't it?
It is. That's right. And that's why my previous book was, how to build a real career. And it talked about developing not just the hard skills, like so many people think they can learn to code and then they're good to go. It's all like, no, that's not enough. Unfortunately, you have to have soft skills, human skills, be able to collaborate effectively on a global scale. And I've talked about that. And my new book talks about that we need a whole new model for how we're going to create work that's useful in the communities. And so we can't just rely on market forces or the central government to provide jobs anymore. We're going to have a new model. That's my view, at least.
Yeah, we are. Unfortunately, some of the youth I talk to, their goal is to get a job with the government because they think that's the only place that's creating jobs and has stability, and as one pointed out, and have pensions, concepts like that, which is unsustainable because that depends on a taxpayer base. Right. So at some point, even that will probably change in a dramatic fashion. So really, jobs in the future are really going to be up to yourself, creating work, creating entrepreneurial, but not opportunities. But not everybody's cut that way, and a lot of people just want something where they can go do the job, come home, and they can have that. But they got to understand it's going to be a relentless retraining. When they come home, they're going to have to go and study because that job's going to go away and finding something out, and that's not fully appreciated to this point in time. Charles, any closing comments you'd like to make?
Gordon, that I hope we have another chance to revisit these large forces of technology and demographics, because so much of what our system relies on for Social Security and Medicare and all these very expensive programs that are, as you say, tax revenue based. What happens when jobs disappear, pay is cut, profits decline as competition increases? Well, tax revenues fall too. So the entire model of we can just pay for everything by raising taxes, well, that model's broken too, as a result of the decline of labor and profitability.
So there's a lot in the participation curve, isn't there?
There is. It impacts everything.
But very few can explain why it's really going down. And I think we've answered a few of the questions here. But there's more than we just talked about. Maybe that's for another show. Charles, talk to you again next month.
Thank you very much, Gordon. My pleasure.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
This has been Gordon T. Long, editor and publisher of GordonTLong.com. New recordings are posted regularly and can be found at GordonTLong.com. New show notifications are available through RSS feed, iTunes, and other social networking venues at GordonTLong.com.